Every Thanksgiving, my family gathers at Aunt Laura's farmhouse. It is a tradition. Every year brings the same worn-out stories, endless dishes of green bean casserole, and football games blaring in the background. But last year, Thanksgiving felt different. It was the first time I truly feared for my life. We arrived early in the afternoon. Aunt Laura's house is tucked deep in the countryside, surrounded by miles of empty fields. Her home always looks pristine, like something out of a catalog, with perfectly arranged decor and the comforting smell of cinnamon in the air. Despite this, something felt off the moment I walked through the door. I tried to shake it off, blaming my nerves or the dread of hours with relatives. I wish I had paid more attention to that feeling. Dinner was planned for 5 p.m. By 4:30, the house was bustling. Cousins were running through the halls. The adults were huddled in the kitchen, and Aunt Laura's voice carried over everything, barking orders to keep the chaos in check. I stuck close to my dad, avoiding the usual small talk with relatives I only saw once a year. That was when I noticed something strange. Uncle Frank, the loudest and most boisterous member of our family, was missing. He always arrived early, booming laughter announcing his presence long before you saw him. I asked my dad if he had seen him, and he shrugged, saying Uncle Frank must have been running late. But Frank never ran late. At 4:45, Aunt Laura called everyone to the dining room to take their seats. The table was a masterpiece, covered in dishes piled high with steaming food. But as we all gathered, an uneasy silence fell over the group. Aunt Laura stood at the head of the table, a tight smile on her face. "Before we begin, I want to thank you all for coming," she said, her voice strained. "But before we say grace, I need to ask something important." Her tone caught everyone's attention. The room stilled. She looked around the table, her eyes lingering on each of us. "Has anyone seen Frank today?" The murmurs started immediately. No one had seen him. Aunt Laura's face tightened, and she clutched the back of her chair so hard her knuckles turned white. "He went out early this morning to pick up a turkey from a local farm," she explained. "I haven't heard from him since." A cold knot formed in my stomach. The nearest farm was at least 20 minutes away, and Uncle Frank had left hours ago. Someone suggested calling him, but Aunt Laura shook her head. "I've tried. His phone keeps going straight to voicemail." The room buzzed with nervous chatter, but Aunt Laura's voice cut through it. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said quickly. "Let's eat. He'll show up." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. As the meal began, the tension lingered. Forks clinked against plates, but the usual laughter and conversation were missing. I could barely eat. My eyes kept darting to the empty chair where Uncle Frank should have been sitting. At some point, the lights flickered. Just once, for a second, but it was enough to draw every eye to the overhead fixture. Aunt Laura laughed nervously, saying it was probably the wind. I wasn't so sure. I glanced out the window into the pitch-black fields. The wind was still. After dinner, I offered to help Aunt Laura clean up. Most of the family had settled into the living room, their unease dulled by full bellies and wine. While I scraped plates into the trash, I noticed something strange. Uncle Frank's coat was hanging by the back door. His boots were sitting neatly on the mat. My chest tightened. If he had left this morning, why would his coat and boots still be here? I turned to Aunt Laura, but before I could say anything, the power went out. Pitch darkness swallowed the house. A few startled yells echoed from the living room, followed by the sound of someone fumbling for their phone flashlight. Aunt Laura froze next to me, her hand clutching the counter. "Stay here," she whispered. Ignoring her, I followed her to the living room, where the family was gathered in a cluster of flashlights and confusion. Aunt Laura tried to calm everyone down, saying the storm must have knocked the power out. But when I peeked out the window, the skies were clear. A sudden noise cut through the darkness, a faint metallic clattering coming from the basement. Everyone froze. Aunt Laura's face went pale, and she muttered something under her breath. My dad, always the pragmatist, grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the basement door. "Stay here," he said firmly. But I couldn't. Something was wrong. I followed him down the creaking stairs, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the shadows. The smell hit me first, a sharp, metallic tang that made my stomach churn. My dad stopped short, and the flashlight trembled in his hand. Uncle Frank was there. His lifeless eyes stared up at us, and his body was crumpled on the cold concrete floor. Blood pooled beneath him, seeping into the cracks. Next to him was a hunting knife, its blade glinting in the faint light. My dad grabbed my arm and pulled me back upstairs. He shouted for someone to call the police, his voice shaky and urgent. The rest of the night blurred into chaos sirens, flashing lights, and the horror etched on everyone's faces. The police ruled it an accident. They said Uncle Frank had slipped while cleaning the knife. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Thanksgiving at my parents' house was always a tradition, but last year, something changed. My sister Emily and I had planned to drive together, like we did every year, but this time she insisted we take a different route. "It's faster," she said, flashing that overly confident grin that always got her into trouble. I should have argued harder. We set off late in the afternoon, the sun dipping below the horizon as we left the city. Emily's shortcut took us down a narrow 2-lane road that twisted through dense woods. It felt isolated, but I figured she'd checked the GPS. Besides, I trusted her. She was always the adventurous one, the risk taker, the one who made life interesting. 30 minutes in, my phone lost signal. "Do you still have service?" I asked. Emily glanced at her phone, shaking her head. "Relax," she said. "We'll be there in no time." But the road kept stretching on, with no signs, no cars, no lights. Just miles of trees swallowing the fading daylight. After another 20 minutes, my patience wore thin. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowed the car and squinted at the road ahead. "I think we're fine. It's just... I don't recognize this part." The words sent a chill down my spine. Emily never admitted she was lost. I glanced around the car, the headlights illuminating nothing but endless trees and patches of cracked asphalt. The thought crossed my mind that we hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. We drove in tense silence for a while longer until a figure appeared on the side of the road. A man in a red flannel jacket, walking with his head down and hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Should we stop and ask for directions?" Emily asked. Something about him unsettled me. "No," I said quickly. "Just keep driving." But as we passed him, he looked up, and I swear, he stared directly at me through the window, his face emotionless, pale, almost ghostly. I shuddered and looked away. Emily noticed. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, but my heart was racing. The road grew darker, the trees closing in like a tunnel. Emily finally admitted she had no idea where we were. "We should turn around," she said, her voice unusually quiet. I agreed, relieved to finally go back the way we came. She pulled into a narrow clearing to make a U-turn, and that's when the headlights swept across something in the trees. A parked truck. Rusted, old, with no plates. I stared at it, my stomach sinking. "Why would someone leave their truck here?" I whispered. Emily didn't answer. She just shifted the car into reverse. But before we could pull away, the man from the road stepped out of the woods. He was standing right in front of us, illuminated by the headlights. "Lock the doors," I hissed. Emily didn't need to be told twice. The man didn't move, didn't wave, didn't yell. He just stood there, staring at us, his hands still buried in his pockets. Emily panicked, slamming the car into reverse too hard. The tires spun in the dirt, but the car barely moved. The man started walking toward us, slowly, calmly. "Go!" I shouted. Emily floored it, the tires catching just enough to launch us backward onto the road. She spun the wheel, and the car swerved violently as we sped back the way we came. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him running after us, but he didn't. He just stood there in the middle of the road, watching us leave. We didn't stop again. We didn't talk. We didn't breathe until we saw the glow of the city lights on the horizon. When we finally reached my parents' house, Emily tried to laugh it off. "We just got a little lost," she told everyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if we'd stopped, if we'd hesitated, things would have gone very differently. Even now, I can't explain it. There was nothing supernatural about what happened. But every Thanksgiving since, I've avoided shortcuts, woods, and empty roads. Last Thanksgiving, I decided to spend the holiday alone for the first time in my life. My family had begged me to come home, but I wasn't in the mood. Work had been stressful, my social life non-existent, and honestly, I just wanted a quiet evening in my small rental cabin deep in the woods. It was supposed to be peaceful. The cabin was cozy enough, basic, but comfortable. A stone fireplace, an old wooden table, and windows that looked out into nothing but endless forest. I'd brought a small turkey breast to cook, and a bottle of wine to keep me company. As the sun set, the isolation hit me harder than I expected. No sounds of family chatter, no clinking plates, just the wind howling through the trees. I tried to distract myself by prepping dinner. I lit a fire, set the turkey in the oven, and poured myself a glass of wine. But the quiet, unnerving. Around 7 p.m., I sat down to eat. The fire crackled, the food smelled amazing, and for a brief moment, I felt at peace. But then, I heard it. A faint crunching sound like someone stepping on dry leaves. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. The sound came again, closer this time, I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded deliberate, like footsteps. I got up, walked to the window, and peered out into the darkness. Nothing. Just trees swaying in the wind. I sat back down, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. But then, I heard a soft knock. Not at the front door, at the window. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The window by the fireplace was partly covered by a curtain, but through the gap I could see something. A shape. A figure standing just outside, watching me. My first instinct was to scream, but my throat locked up. The figure didn't move, didn't try to open the window. It just stood there, staring. I couldn't make out a face, just the faint outline of someone tall, wearing what looked like a hood or a hat. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and dialed 911. No signal. Of course, I was too far out. Heart pounding, I grabbed the fire poker and shouted, "Who's there?" No response. The figure stayed perfectly still. I inched closer to the window, gripping the poker tightly, trying to see better. But before I could reach it, the figure moved just a step back, into the darkness. Then another. And then it was gone. For a long moment, I stood there, staring out into the empty yard. My pulse thundered in my ears. Finally, I forced myself to lock every door and window. I turned off the lights, hoping that staying quiet and hidden would keep me safe. Hours passed. The fire died down, and the cabin was swallowed by darkness. I stayed in the corner, clutching the poker, every noise outside setting my nerves on edge. I thought maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe the figure wasn't real. Then just before dawn, I heard the sound again. Crunching leaves. This time it circled the cabin. Slow, purposeful. Once, twice. I held my breath, praying whoever or whatever it was would just leave. By morning, the noises had stopped. The first light of dawn spilled through the windows, chasing away the shadows. Gathering my courage, I stepped outside, determined to find some sign of what had happened. At first, there was nothing. Just the damp, cold ground. But then I saw them. Footprints. Leading from the woods to the cabin and back again. I followed them around the cabin, my pulse quickening. On the back porch, near the kitchen window, I found something else. A single piece of paper. It was folded neatly and weighted down with a small rock. With trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. The note had only 3 words, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "See you soon." I packed my things and left the cabin that morning, leaving the turkey half-eaten and the fire poker by the door. I haven't gone back since, and I never spend Thanksgiving alone anymore.